So this is the, hi, I know it's that time of evening. Hello. Okay, I'm gonna, folks, take your seats if you're ready, and otherwise there are other quieter areas in the distance. Okay, this is our second to last session of the day. It is my distinct pleasure to be introducing our two interlocutors for this session. To my left, one of our speakers today, Glen Coulthard, known to everyone here, but I will nevertheless introduce Dr. Coulthard, is a member of the Yellowknives Dean First Nation and Associate Professor in the First Nations and Indigenous Studies program and the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. He's going to present his paper titled Palestinians and Native Peoples Are Comrades: The Political Economy of Indigenous-Palestinian Solidarity. In conversation with Dr. Coulthard will be Dr. Sherene Seikaly, who many of you had the opportunity to attend her amazing keynote presentation yesterday from last night. Yes. Sherene Seikaly is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. Every time I say that, I feel both immensely proud and I want to continue to feel hopeful. And also the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UCSB, the co-editor of the Stanford Studies, Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies and Culture Studies, Middle Eastern Societies and Culture series, and the co-editor of Jadaliya. Please join me in welcoming Glen Coulthard and Sherene Seikaly.
Can you hear me? Yeah, this is fine. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I apologize in advance. I've got an ear infection in my left ear, and this is all very disorienting to me. So I'm just going to tell a story about how I came to this part of this research project. So I was privileged enough to have sabbatical last year, which I spent in Toronto as a fellow at the University of Toronto. And that was September 23rd I arrived, and I was getting geared up to like the last push for this book on Maoist influences on Red Power activism and organizing during the long 70s, so between 1967 and 1982 in Canada. I had a couple of talks geared up about the book, but then October 7th happened. October 7th happened, and I was writing a book on Indigenous internationalism and ultimately solidarity with the Third World, with Black Power in the United States. And I figured that I couldn't write a book on solidarity ultimately without excavating and looking into the role that Palestine played in this organizing in the 1970s. So my first talk was in probably November, so it was quite early into the genocide. And I gave it on Dene internationalism, our relationship with Tanzania, and so on. And then I ended it with this written statement of solidarity from Indigenous folks that I had written with Leanne Simpson and Nick Estes and Wayake Amali. And the shit hit the fan in the comments. There was a couple of Zionist profs who were like, we came to hear about this political history of Indigenous peoples, and what the hell does this have to do with Israel, and why are you going on this fucking tirade against Israel and pro-Hamas? So started thinking, and this was at a time, it should be noted, it was early in the genocide, so we didn't have the gift of lawsuits against UBC by my fucking dimwit colleagues, which neatly tie all these things together: indigenous struggle, anti-racist fucking education, and then struggles in support of Palestine. So I wanted to tease out these connections and use the time and the privilege that I had in Toronto to explore this further and to show a material relationship of solidarity that demonstrated that our fates were entwined. So it's nice and good that there's this ethics of empathy and so on, but I wanted to show the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of this solidarity. So this is where that research has taken me, and that's why I don't have a book yet. So in the winter of 2023, Leanne Simpson, Waiakea Malley, Kelsey Wrightson, Robert Maynard, and myself began organizing to hold the second grounded solidarity gathering on Chief Draghi's territory, Treaty 8, the traditional and unextinguished homelands of my people, the Yellowknives Dene. Between June 24th and June 29th, 2024, we gathered a group of academics, activists, artists, and students, and it was hosted by Dechinta Center for Research and Learning, which is a land-based political education project I helped found in Denende back in 2010. Drawing on the example of previous generations of Dene organizers, Dechinta seeks to break the historical relationship forged between colonial genocide, dispossession, and economic dependency on the one hand, and the institutions of Western education on the other. Organizing for the gathering began in the wake of the genocidal campaign waged by Israel against the Palestinians of Gaza following the mass military operation of October 7th, 2023. The purpose of this meeting was twofold. Practically speaking, we aim to situate the land as a generative site of solidarity organizing by calling on my community to host a diversity of activists from around the globe to engage in land-based practices like duck hunting, fishing, hide tanning, medicinal harvesting, etc., to discuss issues of mutual concern, to establish meaningful and effective bonds of mutual aid, and to cultivate a much-needed place of refuge and regeneration for a group of worn comrades passionately committed to the intersecting communities they serve. In a more conceptual vein, the get-together aimed to dislodge what I see as the all-too-common misunderstanding that a politics rooted in land or place forecloses the possibility of cultivating wider, effective, and material relationships. In other words, the Solidarity Gathering sought to demonstrate that immersion in the diversity of relationships and ethical practices that constitute the land from a Dene perspective, as opposed to treating the land as a commodity or property, can and indeed does facilitate an expansive sense of belonging that both traverses but also ties together a multiplicity of forms of life and community struggles. For us, the land facilitates relationships of solidarity as opposed to its opposite. So I was tasked with kind of trying to provide a historical example that brings some of these conceptual issues to light, and my intervention will do the same here today. I place the anti-colonial struggles of the Dene, especially during the height of Red Power in the 1970s, with those of Palestinians by highlighting the material basis of solidarity envisioned between Indigenous peoples here and there. Specifically, I do this through an examination of colonial development in the North and how our relational conception of land tied us to the political economy of those struggling against processes of land theft, occupation, and genocide abroad. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, a pivotal moment in the colonization of the North came in 1967, when the federal government announced its plans to transfer the administrative center of the Northwest Territories from Ottawa to Yellowknife. Prior to this, Canada maintained direct colonial control over northern political and economic development from Ottawa through the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. After the transfer, the size and power of the newly formed government of the Northwest Territories and its non-native constituency increased dramatically. As the colonizing population continued to grow, the newcomers began to pressure the federal government to push northern economic projects to boost employment, mostly in the form of non-renewable resource development. After all, the forms of development that the South has in mind for the North are the extraction of natural resources. The convergence of economic and political development was no coincidence. In the years immediately preceding the establishment of Yellowknife as the political capital of the Northwest Territories, anticipation was growing over the possibility of future petroleum discoveries in the off the northern shores of Canada and the United States. This excitement was justified, and in 1968, a massive reservoir of oil and natural gas was discovered beneath Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. This resulted in an intensification of resource exploration in the Mackenzie Delta, the Arctic Islands, and the Beaufort Sea. Subsequent oil and gas finds resulted in numerous proposals to transport these resources from the north to southern markets, including the use of tankers and, of course, pipelines. Now, the increase in oil and gas development, particularly through the proposed construction of a pipeline right away down the Mackenzie River Valley, reached fever pitch in the early 1970s. Exasperating this was the newfound demand for a domestic source of oil and natural gas caused by the energy crisis of 1973. This crisis was spawned by the Arab-Israeli War of the same year, which prompted the Arab nations of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, to place an embargo on oil exports to the United States and its allies for providing increased military aid to Israel during its escalating colonial interventions in Palestine and Arab territories, particularly the Sinai and Golan Heights. By 1973, OPEC owned and controlled most of the world's oil resources, production, and trade, with its Arab member states maintaining the power to determine output and price. Subsequently, the 1973 decision by Arab OPEC members to use oil production and transport as a weapon against Western imperialism had a devastating effect on the US economy, with 500,000 jobs lost and the GNP falling over $10 billion in the first 6 months. In 1976, Stolo artist and organizer Lee Merkel and her then partner Ray Bob were part of a socialist study group that wrote a piece titled "Native Peoples and Palestinians Are Brothers," outlining the connection between anti-colonial resistance abroad and extraction at home. To my mind, it brilliantly links the struggles of the Dene with Palestinians through a political economy of land and oil. And I'm going to quote at length this section here. The ripening of contradictions and the growth of the struggle in the Middle East, the main source of oil for imperialism, brought about an energy crisis in the imperialist nations. From that time, we can detect an alteration in their profit-making strategy. They redirected their investments in oil exploration from the Middle East to the imperialist nations, so Canada, the US. The rationale for this was that the growth of national liberation and social revolution in the Third World was creating a, quote, unsafe climate of investment at home, or there, sorry. To maintain sources of raw materials, it's necessary to find safe areas of investment. The focus of this redirection is the Canadian North, and by and large, it has already been explored and decisions have been made on the division of the North amongst various imperialist interests. The only impediment holding up a wholesale corporate invasion is the fact that the North is, and has been for tens of thousands of years, the legitimate domain of Native people. It represents the only or one of the only vestiges of genuine national territory for Native people, wherein they can realize the aspiration to which all people are rightly entitled, nationhood. Now, linking our struggles here with those abroad was commonplace during this period. Dene activist Philip Blake highlighted these connections during his testimony at the Berger inquiry against the Mackenzie for the Mackenzie Pipeline in 1975. To summarize, his testimony stated that if the development of our lands was used and distributed to those suffering poverty and colonial dispossession by the same or similar forces in, say, the Middle East or Africa, then as Dene, we would be obligated to develop and share such resources. It is through the land that we are all connected. But given that the colonial state and capital intended to hoard the wealth extracted from our lands for shareholders of corporations in Calgary and Texas, the Dene would sooner blow up the pipeline than see it used in such an unethical way. So what are we to make of all this? I think a number of issues come to the fore. First, 1973 saw the emergence of a number of colonial strategies pertaining to Indigenous land theft here in Canada. These strategies blur the lines between anti-colonial politics in the domestic and international spheres. The first had to do with the development of a continental discourse around so-called energy independence, caused in part by US imperialism abroad. The 1973 oil crisis brought into sharp relief the US and Canada's dependency on foreign oil, especially on states hostile to the imperialism of US foreign policy. Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, etc. Unfortunately, however, seeking a policy solution to energy dependence exacerbated by colonial hostilities elsewhere has often meant an increase in these conflicts at home, a point raised by Miracle and Bob. This was the case during the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline in the 1970s, and similar dynamics remain at play today. For example, proposed pipeline construction and liquefied natural gas development on unceded lands here in the interior of British Columbia is often ideologically justified as a means of weaning ourselves off of both Middle Eastern and Russian fossil fuels. A similar logic is used to justify the extraction of so-called ethical diamonds on Dene land today. Geopolitical hostilities overdetermined by imperialist ambitions abroad come home to roost on Indigenous land. I can't express how important that this is, especially in the context of Donald Trump's administration's foreign policy. A lot has been said today of Canada's nationalist response to this. A benchmark of this response is to double down on the extraction of non-renewable resources in an attempt to once again achieve energy independence or energy sovereignty. Shoring up Canadian energy sovereignty necessarily means undermining native sovereignty. Geopolitical hostilities overdetermined by imperialist ambitions abroad again come home to roost on native land. A second related strategy is also implicitly raised by the analysis above, and which the Dene spent much of the 1970s and 80s fighting against. The state's effort to achieve economic certainty through the extinguishment of our rights and title via the federal government's 1973 Comprehensive Claims Policy, better known as the treaty process, or the modern treaty process here. Again, if seeking North American energy independence was spawned by capital's search for a climate shielded from the negative effects of colonial conflict internationally, i.e. capital flight, search for safe investment, and all that shit, then an analogous strategy would have to be simultaneously concocted at home. This is precisely what the Comprehensive Claims Policy sought to do. 1973 witnessed two monumental court decisions that opened up the debate about who owns and has jurisdiction over vast amounts of lands claimed by Canada. Calder et al. Versus the Attorney General of British Columbia, which was a Supreme Court decision, and Paulette et al. Versus the Registrar of Land Titles, which is a Supreme Court of the Northwest Territories decision. Both cases de facto challenged the sanctity of Crown sovereignty by claiming the Indigenous claimants never had extinguished their rights and title to their respective territories. In BC, because the Nisga'a never signed treaty, and in the Northwest Territories, because Treaties 8 and 11 claimed extinguishment was agreed to, but that was fraudulent. This no doubt caused significant anxiety amongst Canadian political and corporate elites. In order to reconcile potential native ownership and jurisdiction with the Crown's claim to the same, something had to give. Hence the objective of the modern treaty process, to resolve the question of Indigenous rights and title by forcing the extinguishment of such rights as a prerequisite to settlement. Land claims are essentially the state's domestic solution to constructing a safe climate of investment on Indigenous lands. Canada's colonial project is thus multiscalar and directly ties to the struggles of the global south to increase in pressures placed on the Dene people to relinquish their rights and open up their lands to resource extraction and further encroachment of the global capitalist market. However, it's important not to interpret these events to infer that one site of successful resistance in one place only serves to increase the pressures elsewhere. That's not the point of this. Instead, these events simply amplify the deeply entwined material histories and future of the Dene people and other Indigenous peoples in relationship to others. As Philip Blake testified, Dene people have always been aware of the relationship between their struggles against colonialism at home and the struggles against imperialism abroad. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be sharing space with Glen, who's taught us so much about the politics of recognition, about the possibilities of imagining global movements. And I think the invitation very much here is to think about how is it that we stand not just for one another, but with one another. And I think one of the real demands and urgencies of this moment is to perhaps complicate, unpack, redefine what we mean by solidarity. I just want to tell you what it feels like to be up here for somebody who's a little hearing impaired. There's a vent that's really loud, and then there's this beeping sound. I think I'm in the hospital, so if we sound a little crazy, it's because there's like weird things coming at us. So that's why I asked Todd, like, am I hallucinating, or is this actually happening? So it's such an honor to be here, and it's been today such a salve, you know, on this open wound of what it means to watch our people being subject to an industrialized killing machine in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank and in Palestine. It's been really such a space of abundance and healing to be with you all. I have one quick comment about this incredible paper, and then I'm going to move quickly into a couple of questions, if that's okay. I'm going to change the order a little bit. So I wanted to just invite folks because thank you so much for this incredible paper and invitation. I wanted to just make two quick invitations about, because I believe this is going to be a project that's your next book, right? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to make two quick invitations around that. One is the work of Robert Vitalis, who wrote this book, America's Kingdom. And in this book, he showed how Aramco, the American oil company that basically got into a long-term relationship, marriage, I would even say, with what would become the Saudi Arabian government in the Arabian Peninsula, and imported into Saudi Arabia Jim Crow segregation. So all of the oil workers in the Arabian Peninsula were subject to a Jim Crow segregation, right, imported from the United States. So that's number one. Number two, I think as you continue doing this incredible work around the 1973 OPEC moment, I think it would be really inspiring and resonant with your work to look at actually the movements that the OPEC states, when they conducted the boycott in 1973, the movements that they actually extinguished. Anarchists, trade unionists, labor organizers, communists, and in this sense, the state, in a way, in the Arabian Peninsula, was in very concrete ways itself an occupying force. Right, in bed with British imperial interests all throughout the Arabian Peninsula, in what is now Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Kuwait. And so in this sense, I think reading the actual work and the records of these movements, so people like Rosie Bashir, really shows us the way that people in the 50s were thinking with struggles of First Nation and Native American peoples. They were saying, we are the Native Americans of the Arabian Peninsula. And I think seeing it from the perspective of that movement work helps really underscore the power of the work that you're giving us and that you continue to give us. The last point I want to say there is also, I think, Carbon Democracy, the book by Timothy Mitchell, is something that everybody should read. Because it is a book that dismantles all of the discourse on oil extraction in the 20th and 21st century. It shows us how all the rhetoric around scarcity was a construction, that actually it was only in the 21st century that there was oil scarcity, and that the marriage between corporations and governments had manufactured this scarcity so that they could continue to control movements. And he does an amazing thing about comparing the labor organizing of coal workers versus the labor organizing of oil workers, and how much harder the technology of oil manufacturing was, how much it contained actual labor organizing as opposed to coal organizing. Lastly, I would just say in terms of 1973, there was such a big windfall of profit for these Arab states and all of the states of OPEC, and the main beneficiary was the military-industrial complex in the United States. So I think thinking through this beautiful invitation of Palestinians and indigenous people as comrades would necessarily then go after these states as part and parcel of a broader process of dispossession. So I'll leave that out there in case you wanted to comment on it. Would you like to comment now, or should I move to the questions?
I'll just briefly comment.
Okay.
Like, Oh, okay.
Oh, we are? Oh, no.
Share all of yours, and then I'll
Oh, no.
I'll agree and take it to heart.
I mean, the rest of it was really just to honor everything that you've taught us, and I felt like this was a really important moment to return to red skin, white masks, and think about what you taught us about the politics of recognition. I wanted to ask you about land and this invitation of global standing together and struggle, and I wanted to ask you about nationhood versus peoplehood and territoriality.
Okay.
So.
Very quickly then. Thank you for your comments. I agree with them entirely, and I will look into some of the histories that you've invoked here. The one thing that I would say, though, and this isn't saying or putting on a pedestal the OPEC Arab nations and as an anti-imperialist struggle, even though the gesture was due to Western imperialism. It was the response that Canada and the U.S. used to create this domestic discourse around energy crisis and energy sovereignty now. So it facilitated the ongoing and justified ideologically the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples and escalated it to a point where the contemporary or modern Indigenous movement is still grappling with. And I think that what this work does is show this is a moment of the 70s, not to say that this wasn't generations older. And thank you for your kind words on red skin, white mask. This emerged as a response to some of the criticisms that I had about that book, about just potentially appropriating the thought of Frantz Fanon for a struggle that he might not have identified with, but I actually think that he would. So it's black skin, white mask, not red skin, white mask. And so this was just to contextualize the claims in that book and the use of the literature in that book by rooting it in this long history of cross-fertilization and intellectual and physical exchange between Indigenous peoples and Black power and Indigenous peoples in the Third World and Indigenous peoples in Palestine. So it's a contextualization of that work. But thank you.
Sherene, we remain so honored by your presence here. We have a gift. Glenn, maybe you can help me give this to Sherene. So this is a blanket by a Musqueam artist, and it is a symbol of the solidarity that you've been speaking about, because it's the Palestinian sunbird. And this, I want to thank Hay for this blanket that we are just so honored to send you home with. Yeah.